What's a fact that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but is actually true? Back in the 80s, in an effort to crack down on homosexuals within their ranks, the U.S. Navy spent millions of dollars to investigate a woman known only as Dorothy, because undercover agents discovered that many suspected gay men all referenced this name, so they believed she might have been a madam who organized gay meetings, and finding her could help them ID lots of gay men. After several years and millions of dollars of investigation, they determined that questions like, "Are you friends with Dorothy?" was a means of gay men identifying to each other without outing themselves in public. Dorothy never existed. The CIA attempted to use cats to spy on members of the Soviet Union. The cat was put through an hour-long surgery to put a radio transmitter in the cat's ear canal. This was known as Operation Acoustic Kitty. The plan did not work. The cat got run over by a car. The FBI spied on Martin Luther King Jr., gathered evidence of an affair he was having, blackmailed the shit out of him, and tried to get him to kill himself. The United States government paid the CIA to send agents into random bars and spike people's food and drinks with LSD, mescaline, liquid THC, and other drugs, and then take notes on what happened. They also paid a guy to sit on a toilet drinking martinis while watching people have sex with prostitutes on the other side of a one-way mirror. They called it Operation Midnight Climax because the agents were all high on their own supply when they came up with the name. The United States has passed a bill which allows for the invasion of the Netherlands in the event of a prosecution by The Hague of a U.S. service member. That is hilarious and extremely sad, at the same time, LOL. It's what's called a signaling bill. It's a way of telegraphing a position publicly, in such a way that it gives pause to someone else, or appeases another interests. There's no way it will ever be used, because the consequences of doing so would immediately make the United States a pariah, and collapse the world order we control. What this was a repudiation of European and international institutions' opposition to the global war on terror. Essentially the political version of, go bleep yourself. In 1994, the United States Air Force attempted to make a non-lethal weapon that was supposed to turn you gay. It was formally called the gay bomb, and their idea was that the bomb would contain human sexual pheromone, which would release whenever the bomb would be dropped. Whoever would smell or be affected by the pheromones would theoretically turn gay, and the United States Air Force hoped that once the men turned gay, they would be too infatuated by each other to fight, letting America win future wars. Obviously, this was never made, but only because they couldn't get it to work. It did win a satirical Nobel Peace Prize. The concept of jaywalking was invented by car manufacturers because too many people were dying on the roads. Most people in North America would have considered the road to be public space and not the exclusive right of motorists. There was a concerted lobbying effort by Detroit to seize that public space for the exclusive use of car drivers. U.S. Customs and Border Protection can stop, board, and search any vehicle they want within 100 miles of the geographical border of the country. They can also detain and search people to determine if they're U.S. citizens. Edit: I have been informed correctly that this was struck down by the SCOTUS. Sorry to spread some outdated information. It gets better. They also consider a border to be any ingress into the USA, including international airports. So, they can claim to board or search any vehicle within 100 miles of any major airport in the country. The CIA planned Operation Northwoods as a false flag operation in 1962. They were planning on staging a terrorist attack in the United States and blaming it on the Cubans as a pretext to invade Cuba. John F. Kennedy rejected the plans. Anything else that you extrapolate from here becomes a conspiracy theory, but this is what we have documented evidence of. The USA sprayed San Francisco with bacteria to see what happened. Well, what happened? They found out that Serratia marcescens is not in fact completely harmless, like they thought, and with a large enough dose, enough for nearly all of the city's 800,000 residents to inhale at least 5,000 of the particles, will actually cause serious, sometimes deadly, infections, particularly in immunocompromised people. Which inspired a lot of research, but other than that, not much happened. One person almost certainly died as a result, and probably a lot more spikes were seen in IV drug infections, UTIs, cardiac infections, pneumonia, etc. And though there were legal cases, eventually the US government investigated and found themselves not at fault every time, since it wasn't definitely proven the specific bacteria they released that day was the cause of that death or any others. It is a naturally occurring microbe. Legal stuff notwithstanding, immediately, it was pretty obvious back in 1950 that the idea was a bad one, but in true American fashion, they kept trying it many more times, in different cities over the years, with other harmless bacteria and chemicals. The Soviets spent millions of dollars to put several agents into the Pentagon to find out what was going on at the busy meeting place in its center. It was a hot dog stand. The war on drugs started as a racist policy of the Nixon administration. One of Richard Nixon's top advisors, and a key figure in the Watergate scandal, said, "The war on drugs was created as a political tool to fight blacks and hippies," according to a 1994 interview with John Ehrlichman, published in the April 2016 Harper's Magazine. The Nixon campaign in 1968, and the Nixon White House after that, had two enemies, the anti-war left, and black people. Former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman told Harper's writer, Dan Boehm, for the April cover story published Tuesday. "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana, and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities," Ehrlichman said. "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them, night after night, on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. Army sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide, ZNCS, in St. Louis, as part of a Cold War-era military experiment, to test how biological warfare agents might spread in different environments. The Army sprayed the inorganic compound, which glows bright yellow under ultraviolet light, in 20 residential areas, 13 downtown locations, and 2 5-square-mile sections of the city. The Army used a variety of methods to spray the chemical, including blowers on top of buildings, from the backs of station wagons, and via planes. The Army also sprayed the chemical during Operation LAC in 1957 and 1958, which involved dispersing large amounts of ZNCS across the United States. MKUltra, Gulf of Tonkin incident. Dianne Feinstein's personal driver of 20 years, was a Chinese spy, Israel accused of putting surveillance equipment around the White House. Feinstein also received the LAPD's description of the Night Stalker in confidence, then immediately turned around and told news TV cameras, which led to the suspect, Richard Ramirez, being tipped off how much police knew about him and attempting to flee. The light bulb conspiracy. Every light bulb manufacturer in the world signed a pact to make their light bulbs less durable. The first light bulbs were so well made, they couldn't break down easily, and people didn't buy new ones, thus making it less profitable to make light bulbs. I think many products work this way ever since. I've recently learned it was far more complicated. While the light bulbs lasted longer, they also produced less light. The agreement was more, so light bulbs would be more universal. They essentially agreed on a life that was felt to bring the best balance in producing light and having a long enough life. Sugar-free gum can actually help prevent cavities. Chewing sugar-free gum increases saliva production, which helps neutralize acids produced by bacteria in the mouth, wash away food particles, and strengthen tooth enamel through the delivery of minerals like calcium and phosphate. Xylitol, a natural sugar alcohol, used as a sweetener in sugar-free gum, can actually help prevent cavities. Unlike regular sugar, xylitol is not fermented by oral bacteria, which means it does not produce the acids that lead to tooth decay. In fact, xylitol can inhibit the growth of cavity-causing bacteria, Streptococcus mutans, by reducing their ability to stick to the teeth, and reducing their overall presence in the mouth. This makes xylitol-containing gum not only a safer alternative to sugar-sweetened gum, but also an active player in maintaining oral health. Drilling a cavity does not eliminate the bacteria that cause cavities, it merely addresses the structural damage. George Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, was involved in an attempted coup on America that failed, because the general they tried to make the American Mussolini was going through anti-imperialist epiphany at the time. That guy's quote, Smedley Butler, in case anyone was curious, refusing the offer was amazing. He basically said, if you do this, I'll raise an army, and we'll have a real civil war right here at home. Probably the coolest way to tell someone off. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a deal with the Democratic National Committee, headed by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was her co-campaign chair, before becoming DNC chair, where wealthy donors could make one contribution to her campaign, the DNC, and the state parties, in one check. This was called bundling, which makes it easy to Google this to verify. The way it worked is, you'd write a huge check, and the maximum allowed contribution would go to Hillary, the maximum contribution would go to the DNC, and anything left over would go to participating state parties. Sounds elite but legit, right? Problem is, 99.5% of the money that was supposed to go to the state parties to elect down-ballot candidates was instead returned to the DNC, which spent it on ads, indistinguishable from Hillary's, except they didn't have to have the "I'm Hillary Clinton and I approve this message" part. And who was DNC chair before Debbie Wasserman Schultz and stepped down, so DEWS, Hillary's friend, could become chair? That would be Tim Kaine, who would later, somehow, coincidentally, be the one Hillary chose as a running mate. Up until very recently, one company, De Beers, sold nearly all of the diamonds in the world. To this day, however, they still control like 2/3 of the world's diamond trade. They restrict supply to keep prices high, and are the reason diamond engagement rings are a thing in the first place. They happened occasionally, but just weren't the standard until De Beers created an ad campaign. By the way, they also are the origin for the expected pricing. The idea that it should be a certain portion of your salary came from them, originally 1 month, but it crept up further and further. Diamonds aren't nearly as valuable as you think they are. Sandpaper usually has some diamond dust on it, and synthetic diamonds are surprisingly cheap to make. Meanwhile, restricted supply and cartel behavior has kept the price of things, like diamond rings, far higher than it should be. They're also the reason people care about the distinction between a natural diamond and a synthetic one, even though it's extremely unlikely you'd actually be able to tell the difference. The DNC and the RNC both jointly and privately own the National Committee on Presidential Debates, and effectively gatekeep our entire election process. There is virtually no federal oversight over these three private corporations. None of them are legally bound to any sort of charter to provide a clear and free election. See DNC lawyer Bruce Spivia's comment about cigars. Everything in the torture report. After 9/11, the CIA imprisoned and tortured, at black sites, a few hundred, I think, it's like 100 something off the top of my head, people in the Middle East, illegally. The methods they used never worked, and there was already evidence that they didn't work upon their introduction in this plan. Around that time, I met a drunk guy who told me that he was a translate, and that he was called in to pretend that he was a guard, and note everything said during these torture sessions. He then said that it was hard to understand anything they said during the interrogations, and that his translating skills weren't that good. The efficacy of torture in general is way overstated. Torture doesn't make people tell the truth, it makes them say whatever they think will make the torture stop. If you're the Spanish Inquisition, trying to make someone sign a confession for something that you give precisely 0 Fs, whether they did or not, torture is very effective. If you're trying to garner any kind of actionable intelligence, torture is worthless. It requires the victim to know what you want to know, and for you to recognize it as true when it's revealed, both of which are very unlikely. The US government created a department solely dedicated to manipulating the attitude of Americans on how much dairy they should consume, to offset the policies of them artificially propping up the dairy industry, aka the government buying all leftover dairy. They created ad campaigns like "Got Milk" and paid to get cheese added to literally every product. I'm sure that has nothing to do with the sharp increase in obesity rates, or whether or not they will tell the truth to the American people. Whoever holds the office of President of Portugal is the leader of the Knights Templar, or the closest thing to it. When the Templars were excommunicated by the Pope, and many sentenced to death, the King of Portugal at the time, Diniz, gave the Templars refuge in Portugal, in part for their role in conquering lands, as Portugal expanded southward in Iberia. He delayed trying them, and eventually created a new Ordem de Cristo that took in Templars as members. Portugal, and not the church, got to keep control of the group's money and lands. Eventually, the Ordem de Cristo became a symbolic and military club, and the position of leader, to this day, is the President of Portugal. In the 1970s, neocons, including Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, set up a group called Team B to prove their belief that the Soviet Union was zooming ahead in the arms race, despite all intelligence from the CIA's Team A stating the opposite. When they found literally no evidence, they concluded that this meant the Soviets were so sophisticated they could hide all of their new weapons. They said that the US submarine fleet was threatened by a new non-acoustic Soviet listening technology, and that the total lack of evidence it existed was proof it existed. All of this non-evidence was published by the Committee for the Present Danger. Roll on to 2002 and 2003, and neocons, including Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, claimed Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and the reason for their confidence in their existence was the lack of evidence to prove their existence. There is an organization called the Atlas Network, which exists to set up and fund a vast network of right-wing and libertarian lobby groups all over the world. Many of these groups pose as neutral academic think tanks, with names like the Institute of Economic Affairs, or the Center for Policy Studies, and they often appear on political discussion TV shows in that guise. In fact, their job is to influence public opinion and government policy to favor the interests of the people who fund them. This has involved discouraging action on climate change, criminalizing protest, and undermining legislation, which protects the rights of citizens and restrains the actions of corporations. George H.W. Bush was part of the CIA, and in Dallas, when Kennedy was shot. When asked what he was doing when he heard Kennedy was shot, the ultimate boomer meme being that everyone remembers what they were doing, he says he doesn't remember. No context, the effing corn people are giving Vietnamese kids cerebral palsy. The fact Monsanto's continued manufacturing of pesticide and efforts to create GMO corn lead to the creation of Agent Orange, and the damage of their effort has been absolutely effing horrific in Vietnam, and in United States veterans' children. Someone else can write this paper, but the military-industrial complex is held together by jacked-up corn. GMO isn't bad in itself, but Monsanto GMO is sauce to me. Here's my all-time favorite. There's a direct causal link between Nazism and current management doctrines, New Public Management. In fact, the #1 reconversion for high-ranking Nazi lawmakers able to escape justice was teachers or directors in private business schools, and they went on to heavily influence what are now widely implemented management policies. Most famously, the expression human resources comes straight from the Third Reich. Edit, I initially said fourth, like an idiot. Previous, similar terms were created in Britain and France, but they were very niche, and nobody in their right mind would have called humans resources. Now here's a cute one. The first instances of a happiness manager on the workplace have been in yup, Nazi Germany. And there's zero ambiguity on this one's origin. It absolutely sounds like an unhinged leftist pothead theory, and yet, that's solid and sourced knowledge many historians worked on. That weather station, situated in the outback? Yeah, it's not a weather station, it's a spy station, run by the Americans. That's why there are, suddenly, so many Americans in Alice Springs, despite it being a town in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, turns out this one was completely true. Pine Gap is run by the CIA, NSA, and a bunch of other acronyms. On stolen land, no less, and only got started by potentially upsetting a democracy. Several companies made billions of dollars of every war in the last 120 years. Lobbyists for big businesses use nearly unlimited budgets to influence congressional decisions. Social media companies base their algorithms around maximizing user engagement at the expense of truth and safety, and actively suppress any internal movement toward any reforms to increase safety and truth, because that would decrease engagement. Most of the mainstream news sources are owned by a handful of extremely rich people, with agendas that often coincide with that of Claude Schwab. You will own nothing, and you will be happy. Everyone should eat bugs, etc. Nixon ended the war in Vietnam, against the wishes of the U.S. military and intelligence community. Bob Woodward was a naval intelligence officer, before starting at the Washington Post. Watergate was his first big story. 5 of the 6 Watergate break-in suspects were affiliated with the CIA. Deep Throat was the deputy director of the FBI. The president who took over from Nixon was a member of the Warren Commission, and the only U.S. president to never be elected as president or VP. Watergate was literally a military coup. Update: Nixon was also the most popular president in history, winning 49 states in his 1972 re-election, the biggest electoral college victory ever. Our system of financing public works using bonds is an engine that, on average, transfers money from everyone to the rich. Local and state governments, and even the federal government, issue bonds to finance things when there isn't the political will to finance those same things using taxes. The problem is that the only people and entities with the money to buy such bonds are banks, institutional and corporate investors, and rich people, mostly operating through institutional and corporate investors. Those bonds incur interest, so the buyers end up paid back with more money than they spent. Meanwhile, bonds are paid back using taxes and other local government revenue, which the rich are disproportionately spared. Sales taxes, citations, and various other local taxes are regressive rather than progressive, meaning the poor tend to pay a larger proportion of their income to these taxes and citations than the rich. On the whole, this means that financing things with bonds transfers money from everyone else to the investment class. Those who have money to invest are invariably rich. And this engine that transfers money from everyone to the rich is widespread. Every local government that finances projects using bonds participates in this rich person enriching system. I'm still absolutely baffled that the general public doesn't know about the scope and scale of the Iran-Contra scandal. You can literally watch videos of Reagan and Oliver North testifying in Congress that they were involved in CIA operations, smuggling drugs into the United States in order to raise money to arm the Nicaraguan Contras. They tap dance around their involvement by justifying the action by stating that in their opinion, it was necessary. The reality is that anyone who does some research on this scandal ends up having their effing mind blown. It used to take a solid month of research to really go down the rabbit hole, but as of 2024, the only thing someone has to do is watch the series, The Octopus Murders, on Netflix. It will seriously blow your mind and whet your appetite.